the el-Mandeb Strait. 29 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, wedged between Yemen on one side and Eritrea and Djibouti on the other. Translated from Arabic, the name means the Gate of Tears. By the end of this video, you will understand why the people who named it got there first. Every day, a significant share of everything your supermarket contains passes through this gap. Grain, cooking oil, fertilizer. The ingredients of bread that someone in East Africa or South Asia will eat in 3 weeks, assuming the ship gets through on schedule, which since late 2023, it frequently is not. The Gate of Tears connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. The Red Sea connects at its northern end to the Suez Canal. Together, these form a needle through which roughly 12% of all global trade is threaded. Container ships, oil tankers, bulk carriers loaded with Ukrainian wheat, all of them through the same 29-kilometer gap, which is controlled by nobody in particular, and overlooked from the Yemeni coastline by a militia that decided, in November 2023, that it had a point to make. The point in their telling was Gaza, the Houthi campaign. The Houthi movement, formerly Ansar Allah, controls large parts of northern Yemen, including the coastline adjacent to the Strait. They launched their first attacks on commercial vessels in November 2023, framing the campaign as solidarity with Palestinians under bombardment in Gaza. The first ship they seized was a car carrier. The crew was taken hostage. The ship was taken to a Yemeni port. A senior Houthi official announced on state television that this was how it would go until Israel stopped. Whether that framing is sincere or strategically convenient is a matter of ongoing analytical debate. What is not debatable is the result. By early 2024, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency reported a 90% decrease in container shipping through the Red Sea corridor from December 2023 to February 2024. 90%. Not a slowdown, not a disruption. A near total halt of one of the world's most critical commercial corridors in under 90 days. The word disruption flatters what actually happened. A more accurate word is collapse. How shipping reacts to missiles. Step 1, the ships reroute. Instead of threading the needle at the Gate of Tears, they sail south down the East African coast, around the entire continent of Africa, past Cape Agulhas at the southern tip, and back north on the Atlantic side, before re-entering the Mediterranean. This adds approximately 11,000 nautical miles to the voyage and approximately 10 additional days of travel. It adds roughly $1 million in extra fuel per trip. Every trip, for months. The largest shipping company in the world, Maersk, confirmed it was experiencing a 40% increase in fuel costs compared to normal Red Sea routing. Step 2. The insurance industry reacts. War risk insurance rose from approximately 0.6% of cargo value before the crisis to as high as 2% following the attacks. For a single ship carrying $200 million in goods, this difference is not a rounding error. Some insurers withdrew coverage entirely unless operators could certify that the cargo had no connection to Israel, the United States, or the United Kingdom. Ships began broadcasting "No Contact Israel" on their automatic identification systems in an attempt to avoid targeting. This is not a metaphor. These were real broadcasts from real ships on a real maritime identification network in 2024. Step 3. The freight rates explode. Shanghai to Los Angeles container rates jumped from approximately $1,985 per 40-foot container to $3,860 in 5 weeks between December 14, 2023 and January 18, 2024. At certain points during the crisis, freight rates were 3 times their pre-disruption levels. The Center for Economic Policy Research estimated that if these elevated costs persisted, they could add 0.18 percentage points to global inflation in 2024 and 0.23 percentage points in 2025. Those are small numbers in a spreadsheet. They are not small numbers in an economy that has been trying to bring inflation down for 2 years and is now explaining to its population why bread costs more because of a conflict it has no involvement in. Step 4. The just-in-time manufacturing system, which was designed for maximum efficiency and zero slack, begins producing gaps. Automotive production lines stalled waiting for components. Electronics supply chains stretched. These are the visible disruptions, the ones that generate corporate press releases. The less visible disruptions are in the food system, and they take longer to show up, and they show up in places that do not generate corporate press releases. The food system cascade. The Bab el-Mandeb is not primarily an oil corridor, though oil passes through it. It is also a grain corridor, a fertilizer corridor, an edible oil corridor. According to the Congressional Research Service, the Red Sea and Suez route handles roughly 8% of the global grain trade. The International Food Policy Research Institute estimated that 20 to 30% of all wheat exports from the EU, Russia, and Ukraine transit the Red Sea under normal conditions. Wheat bound for North Africa, wheat bound for East Africa and South Asia, fertilizer from multiple origins to wherever the growing season demands, sunflower oil from Ukraine to everywhere sunflower oil goes, which is most places. Now consider who sits at the other end of that supply chain. Egypt and Pakistan are among the world's largest wheat importers. Several East African nations, Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, import a substantial share of their food supply by sea through the same corridor and have no meaningful alternative trade route if it closes. These are not wealthy economies with buffer stocks and strategic grain reserves. These are economies where a 20% increase in wheat import cost translates fairly directly into a 20% increase in the price of bread. There's no absorption mechanism. The price increase passes through to the consumer at the bottom of the income distribution, who is already spending a disproportionate share of income on food. The Belfer Center at Harvard assessed in early 2024 that many East African nations were already rated at crisis level on the IPC acute food insecurity scale. Disruptions producing below-average wheat imports or significant price increases could push them to emergency level, a category defined as malnutrition in 15 to 30% of the population. The World Bank tracks surges in agriculture and export price indices of between 3 and 10% in the first half of February 2024 alone. Wheat and sunflower oil prices began rising. Dairy product delivery to Southeast Asia suffered delays. These are not dramatic headlines. These are the downstream consequences that occur 3 supply chain steps away from the missile launch and do not make the same front page. Egypt, the bystander bill. Here is the part nobody mentions. The country that suffered the single most quantifiable and immediate national economic injury from the Bab el-Mandeb disruption was not a combatant. It was not Israel or the United States or the United Kingdom. It was Egypt. Egypt operates the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is the northern terminus of the same trade corridor. When ships stopped using the gave-tiers, they also stopped using the Suez Canal, because there is no point entering a canal that leads to a strait you cannot safely exit. Egypt lost approximately $7 billion in Suez Canal revenue in 2024 alone, a decline of more than 60% compared to the prior year. Ship transits through the canal fell from over 26,000 in 2023 to 13,213 in 2024, a 50% decline in traffic volume. Egypt was not a party to any conflict. Egypt had no vote in the decisions that triggered the attacks. Egypt was, in the strict logistical sense, a toll booth operator whose road had been closed by a dispute happening 2,000 kilometers away. In an attempt to attract ships back, the Suez Canal Authority offered up to a 75% reduction in transit fees. The ships did not come back. A price discount does not solve a security problem. The canal chairman stated this directly. The security concern, he said, could not be overcome with incentives. Egypt was already mid-negotiation with the IMF on debt restructuring. Canal fees are paid in foreign currency, which the Egyptian economy was struggling to accumulate. The $7 billion shortfall did not arrive at a convenient moment. It rarely does. The reroute and its consequences. Meanwhile, at the other end of the reroute, something unexpected happened in ports that had not asked to be relevant. Arrivals at the Cape of Good Hope region rose approximately 89% in 2024 as vessels shifted route. South Africa's port infrastructure, built for a different volume, a different configuration, was not designed to be the world's emergency shipping corridor. It became one anyway. The port strained, turnaround times lengthened, and the additional fuel burn circumnavigating Africa fed back into the same inflation the central banks were trying to suppress. The military response. The military response came. The United States and United Kingdom launched Operation Poseidon Archer, conducting strikes against Houthi radar sites, missile launchers, drone facilities, and weapon storage depots in areas including Hodeidah, Sana'a, and Sada. In 2025, President Trump launched a more intensive bombing campaign that reportedly cost approximately $1 billion before a ceasefire was announced. After the ceasefire, the group sank 2 more ships. The campaign was described by some analysts as more symbolic than operationally decisive, because the Houthis had dispersed their equipment and could absorb attrition in ways a conventional military force cannot. The cost asymmetry deserves its own moment. A single rerouted voyage costs approximately $1 million in additional fuel. A single anti-drone missile fired by a U.S. Navy destroyer costs somewhere between $1 million and $4 million. The Houthi drones being intercepted cost a fraction of either. This is not new in the history of asymmetric conflict. It is, however, particularly expensive when it is happening at a maritime choke point that the global food system runs through. Ceasefire, recovery, and the next freeze. A U.S. Houthi ceasefire was reached in May 2025. Traffic began cautiously recovering. By November 2025, monthly transits through the Suez reached approximately 1,128, the highest figure since January 2024, though still a fraction of pre-crisis levels. Shipping companies were carefully and individually testing the water. Then, in early 2026, the conflict landscape shifted again. The Iran-U.S.-Israel war began. New threats were issued simultaneously against the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb. The partial recovery, 6 months of cautious progress, froze. Ships that had begun recalculating their routes switched back to the Cape of Good Hope calculation they could price with confidence. Energy analysts warned that a simultaneous closure of both Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb could block up to a quarter of the world's oil and gas supply. Cambridge Middle East specialist Elizabeth Kendall described the scenario as potentially able to cripple trade between Asia and Europe. The cumulative excess shipping costs from this disruption have been estimated at $7 to $9 billion annually. Goods worth approximately $1 trillion were disrupted in the first 7 months of the crisis alone, by one private sector estimate. The architecture of fragility. A militia fired missiles from a country that does not appear in the top 100 economies by GDP. The global food system rerouted around a continent. A bystander nation lost $7 billion. Several of the world's most food-insecure populations absorbed the cost in bread prices. The naval superpowers spent $1 billion in airstrikes and achieved a temporary ceasefire that lasted until the next escalation. The Gate of Tears is named for its sailing conditions. The original sailors were describing weather. They had no way of knowing they were also describing the management of the global supply chain, 2,000 years in advance, with uncomfortable precision. The lesson of the Bab el-Mandeb is not specifically about Yemen. It is not about missiles or shipping insurance or even the conflict that triggered the attacks. It is about what happens when you build a global food distribution system optimized for efficiency and stripped of redundancy. You get low costs and fast delivery in normal conditions. You get a continent-sized detour, $7 billion in collateral revenue loss, and a malnutrition risk advisory for East Africa when a single 29-kilometer gap becomes contested. One Strait, one decision. And the bill gets paid by people who had no seat at any table where any of these decisions were made. That's the food system explained. Efficient by design, fragile by consequence. And at the time of recording, waiting. Again, to find out what happens next.